A former Navy SEAL was less than 1 hour from the review that could restore the life he had fought 2 years to reclaim. Then his German shepherd saw an elderly woman walking alone in a violent coastal storm, soaked, shaking, and close to collapse. Caleb Turner had every reason to keep driving. The board was waiting. The mission was leaving, and second chances did not come often. But one low whine from Ranger made him look back. What Caleb did next cost him the future he thought he wanted, and led him to a family he never expected to find. Cold rain swept across the Chesapeake Bay Bridge tunnel, turning the morning road into a ribbon of gray glass. Beyond the windshield, the water on both sides of the causeway looked restless and dark, and the low clouds pressed so close to Virginia that the sky seemed to be leaning on the earth. Caleb Turner drove with both hands locked on the wheel of his black pickup. At 36, he was tall and broad through the shoulders, with close-cut dark brown hair, rough stubble along his jaw, and gray-blue eyes that missed very little and trusted even less. He wore a black rain jacket over a navy shirt, gray tactical pants, and dark brown boots polished more from habit than pride. In the back seat, Ranger lay with his head raised. The German shepherd was 6 years old, heavy through the chest, black and tan with a dark saddle down his back and amber eyes that seemed to read weather, people, and trouble before anyone else noticed them. He had been Caleb's canine partner through deployments, recovery work, and the long 2 years since Caleb had left active SEAL operations. Today was supposed to be the final step back. In 47 minutes, Caleb was due at Joint Expeditionary Base Little Creek, Fort Story, for an in-person review that had been scheduled for weeks. If the board approved him, he and Ranger would support Operation Harbor Light, a Caribbean storm relief mission where SEAL experience, canine search work, and disciplined hands were badly needed. Caleb had passed the medical evaluation. He had passed the physical standards. He had sat through therapy reviews with his jaw tight, and his answers honest enough to sting. Today was the last locked door. The wipers beat hard against the rain. Ranger shifted. Caleb glanced in the mirror. Easy, boy. Ranger did not settle. His ears rose. His body went rigid. His gaze fixed past Caleb's shoulder toward the right side of the road. Caleb followed it and saw nothing at first except rain guardrail and a blur of marsh grass bending under wind. Then a pale shape moved near the shoulder. A woman. She was small, elderly, and walking alone against the storm. Her short white hair clung to her face. A soaked beige cardigan hung from her thin shoulders instead of a real coat. One hand pressed against her chest, and the other reached toward the roadside posts, as if the air itself might hold her up. Caleb's foot eased off the gas. The truck rolled past her slowly. He looked at the clock. 7:11. The board would not wait forever. Members had come from Norfolk, Coronado, and Tampa. Operation Harbor Light deployed in 2 weeks. This was not a meeting a man casually missed. Someone else would stop. A state trooper, a local, a road crew, someone whose whole future was not sitting on the next 40 minutes. Ranger whined, low and sharp. Caleb kept driving. Not now, he said, though he did not know if he meant Ranger, the woman, or the old ache rising under his ribs. The woman shrank in the side mirror. Rain swallowed her. Caleb drove another 100 yards, then another. Ranger turned fully in the back seat and stared out the rear window. Caleb saw it in the mirror. The old woman had stopped. She stood bent beside a marker post, head lowered, one hand gripping the wet wood. Her knees dipped once. Not a fall. The warning before one. Caleb's jaw tightened. His mother had been 71 when she died on a Tennessee highway, while Caleb was somewhere in the Middle East, 12 time zones away, listening to a chaplain explain funeral plans through a broken connection. His father had died before the ambulance arrived. His mother had died in surgery. Caleb had not made it home in time for either service. The last voicemail she ever left him still sat on an old phone in a drawer, unheard because he knew one sentence in her voice would loosen every knot he had tied inside himself. Ranger whined again. This time Caleb listened. He checked the lane, hit the brakes, and pulled onto the shoulder hard enough for gravel and rainwater to snap under the tires. For 1 second, he sat there with the engine ticking and the future, waiting beyond the storm. Then he shifted into reverse. The truck backed down the shoulder with careful urgency, hazard lights blinking red into the gray. When he reached the woman, he put the truck in park and stepped into the rain before doubt could get dressed. Cold water struck his face and ran under his collar. "Ma'am," he called, keeping his voice low. "Can you hear me?" The woman lifted her head. Her eyes were pale blue, unfocused at first, then startled by the sight of him. She tried to straighten. "I'm all right," she said, but her voice shook so hard the words nearly broke. Caleb moved closer but left space. Ranger watched through the open rear window, silent now, alert as a sentry. "You're soaked through," Caleb said. "How long have you been walking?" She looked down the road, then back at him. "I thought there was a gas station closer." "There isn't." A thin, embarrassed breath escaped her. That would explain a few things. Her humor cost her. Caleb could see it in the tremor of her hands. He opened the passenger door and turned the heat high. "Come on, let's get you out of the rain." She hesitated, holding on to dignity as if it were a life raft. "I don't want to trouble you." "You already did," Caleb said gently. "Now let me make it useful." Surprise flickered across her face. Then she let him guide her to the truck. Her arm felt too cold through the soaked sleeve. Ranger shifted backward without command, giving her room. The woman looked at him and softened. "Well," she whispered, shivering as Caleb closed the door. "Aren't you a serious gentleman?" Ranger blinked once as if accepting the rank. Caleb climbed behind the wheel, pulled an emergency blanket from the console, and handed it over. "What's your name, Marianne?" she said, gathering silver foil around her shoulders. "Marianne Walker, Caleb Turner. That's Ranger." "Ranger," she repeated, like the name had weight. "Good name." Caleb checked the clock, 7:18. His hands were wet on the steering wheel. The review board was waiting. The road toward the base ran straight ahead through the rain. But Marianne's fingers trembled against the emergency blanket, and Ranger's eyes in the mirror were steady on Caleb as if the dog already knew which mission had come first. Rain hammered the roof of Caleb Turner's truck as he drove off the shoulder and guided Marianne Walker toward Norfolk. The cab slowly warmed, but the storm had already worked its way into her bones. Water dripped from her cardigan onto the floor mat, and her hands kept tightening and loosening around the emergency blanket, like she was trying to remember how fingers behaved. Ranger stayed in the back seat, calm and upright, his amber eyes moving between Caleb and the woman beside him. He did not crowd her. He did not whine now. The warning had been delivered. "Where were you trying to go?" Caleb asked. Marianne looked out at the rain as if embarrassed by the whole world. "A cardiology appointment." "Where?" "Centaura, Norfolk." "I thought I had time." "In this weather?" "My husband used to say I had more pride than good sense." A tiny smile touched her mouth and vanished. He was not always wrong. Caleb kept the truck steady while a gust shoved rain across the windshield. "What happened to your car?" "My Buick chose today to become a historical object. It died. With drama." She gave a small cough. "My phone died after I called roadside assistance. The map made the next gas station look close. I waited half an hour, then decided I could walk." Caleb glanced at her shoes. They were soaked canvas slip, ons dark with water and mud. You could barely stand. That became clear later. Ranger let out a low breath from the back seat, not quite judgment, but near enough. Marianne turned slightly toward him. "Yes, I know. Your friend disapproves. He has a strong opinions department. He should run for office, despite himself." Caleb almost smiled. The hospital lights appeared through the rain 20 minutes later, warm and white beneath the emergency entrance canopy. Caleb parked and came around before Marianne could argue. A nurse saw them through the glass doors and hurried out with a wheelchair. One look at Marianne ended all debate. The next hour disappeared into blankets, questions, blood pressure readings, temperature checks, forms, and the sharp hospital smell of disinfectant and burnt coffee. Ranger walked beside Caleb on a loose leash, quiet as a shadow. Nurses glanced at him, smiled, then looked at Caleb's face and decided not to ask unnecessary questions. Dr. Samuel Pierce arrived with thin glasses, tired eyes, and a coffee stain on his cuff. He reviewed Marianne's chart, then stepped into the hallway where Caleb waited. "You brought her in at the right time." Caleb folded his arms. "How bad?" "Not critical, fortunately." The doctor looked through the door at Marianne, who sat wrapped in hospital blankets and arguing politely with a nurse about whether she needed another warm compress. Mild hypothermia, dehydration, exhaustion. Her body temperature had dropped below where I like to see it. Another hour out there, and we would be having a different conversation. The hallway seemed to quiet around Caleb. Somewhere nearby, a cart rattled over tile. Ranger sat beside his leg and leaned just enough for Caleb to feel him. Marianne was safe. That should have been the whole answer. It was not. When Caleb finally checked his phone, the screen lit with evaluation office, administrative staff, Commander Ellis, voicemails, messages asking where he was, timestamps stacked like evidence. Caleb's stomach tightened. Marianne saw the change when he came back into her room. "Something happened. I've got somewhere I was supposed to be. The important place." He nodded once. Her face shifted, guilt arriving before he could stop it. "You should go. You're not discharged. I am in a hospital bed surrounded by people who enjoy telling me what to do. Go. If they discharge you before I call, do not walk anywhere." Marianne lifted an eyebrow. "Yes, sir. I'm serious. So am I." Then her expression softened. "Thank you, Caleb." He gave a single nod because anything warmer might break the morning open. Ranger rose when he did. But before they left, the German Shepherd walked to the side of Marianne's bed and rested his muzzle lightly on the blanket near her hand. Marianne touched his head with trembling fingers. "You knew, didn't you?" Ranger stayed still. Caleb looked away. The rain had weakened by the time he reached Little Creek. Fort Story. The sky was still low, but thin light had begun to show behind the clouds, which felt almost cruel. In the parking lot outside the evaluation building, several spaces were empty. Too many. Caleb stepped inside with water still darkening his jacket. The woman at the front desk recognized him immediately. Her expression answered before her mouth did. They waited. Caleb stood very still. "Commander Ellis. Conference Room 3. The room had the abandoned feel of a place where important decisions had already walked out. Water bottles sat half full on the table. Folders were stacked. A projector screen glowed blue against one wall. Commander Mark Ellis, a square-shouldered man in his late 40s with close gray hair and tired fairness in his eyes, listened without interrupting while Caleb told him everything. The road, Marianne. Ranger's warning. The hospital. Pierce. The missed calls. When Caleb finished, Ellis leaned back and rubbed one hand over his chin. "I would have stopped too." The words hit harder than Caleb expected. For a second, hope stirred. Then Ellis slid the calendar toward him. "The problem is not your reason." Caleb looked down. "The problem is logistics. One board member is already headed back to Coronado. Another has a flight to Tampa. Norfolk can hold only so much open. It took weeks to assemble them." He paused, and Caleb saw the rest before he said it. "Operation Harbor Light deploys in 2 weeks. The earliest normal reschedule is 3 weeks out." The words landed flat. The mission was gone. The door he had spent 2 years fighting toward had closed while he held an old woman upright in the rain. Caleb nodded because discipline still knew what to do when the heart did not. "Understood." Ellis's face softened a fraction. "Turner." Caleb looked at him. What you did this morning matters. Caleb wanted to believe that was enough. He could not. That night, rain returned over Chesapeake in a softer voice. Caleb sat on a stool in his garage, staring at the pressed uniform hanging in a clear garment bag. Ranger lay on the concrete beside him, chin on paws. The garage smelled of cedar, motor oil, wet fabric, and old canvas. Caleb was not angry at Marianne. He was not angry at Ellis. He was not even angry at Ranger. Life had simply placed two right things in the same morning and demanded he choose one. Hours passed. His coffee went cold. One question kept coming back through the rain. If that morning happened again, would he still stop? The next few days came to Caleb Turner, as if the world had lowered its volume. Rain moved in and out of Chesapeake, soft 1 hour and hard the next, and the pine trees behind his small house shook water from their branches like dogs waking from sleep. Caleb still rose before dawn. He still ran the same route along the wet road, still fed Ranger at 0600, still checked the truck, the gear cabinet, the leash hooks, the garage lock. Habits remained. Purpose did not. The unit group chat kept moving without him. Cargo schedules, weather updates, notes about the Caribbean relief route. A picture of pallets loaded with medical supplies and portable water systems. Someone joked about who had packed the worst coffee. Caleb read every message. His thumb hovered over the keyboard more than once. He sent nothing. Ranger noticed. Of course he did. The German Shepherd followed Caleb from room to room with no visible reason, settling near doorways and watching him with patient eyes. By Thursday night, Caleb found himself standing in the garage again. The uniform hung inside the clear garment bag, dark and pressed, waiting like a life behind a zipper. A storage bin sat below it filled with old patches, photos, gloves, and a folded flag from a memorial service he had attended for someone else's family, because showing up for other people had always been easier than facing the empty places in his own. Caleb touched the garment bag once, then let his hand fall. Ranger stood beside the truck the next morning before Caleb opened the house door fully. The dog walked down the porch steps, crossed the damp driveway, and sat beside the driver's door. Caleb frowned. "You want a ride?" Ranger stared at him. "That is not an answer." Ranger did not move. A minute passed. Then another. Caleb looked toward the road. A memory surfaced without permission. Marianne Walker wrapped in silver foil, pale but smiling, her hand on Ranger's head. Her guilt when she realized what Caleb had missed. Caleb sighed. "You are getting pushy in your old age." Ranger blinked once. 25 minutes later, they were on the road to Cape Charles. The town sat near the water with old houses, porch swings, church steeples, gulls, and the kind of quiet that made every sound seem personal. Marianne lived in a white cottage, a few blocks from the bay, with a blue front door, a narrow garden beaten flat by rain, and a porch light that stayed on though it was morning. Caleb knocked once. The door opened faster than expected. For a second Marianne only stared. Then her whole face changed. "Well, look at that." Her smile spread like sun breaking through cloud. "I was beginning to think I dreamed you both." Ranger slipped past Caleb and walked inside, as if the invitation had been filed previously. Marianne laughed. "Apparently the dog remembers me. He remembers everyone." "Good. I would hate to be forgettable." The house smelled of cinnamon, coffee, old books, and lemon polish. Photographs lined the shelves. Many showed a broad-shouldered man in navy dress blues, then civilian sweaters, then gray hair and a softer smile. David Walker. Caleb knew it before Marianne said his name. "My husband," she said, watching his eyes. Navy chaplain. He could calm a room full of sailors faster than most officers could clear their throats. Caleb nodded. "Looks like he laughed a lot." He did, sometimes at inappropriate times, which I considered one of his spiritual gifts. She led Caleb to the kitchen. Her steps were better than before, but slower than she wanted him to notice. Ranger noticed. He paced himself beside her. On the counter sat medication bottles, a half-eaten piece of toast, and a doctor's discharge packet weighted down by a mug. Caleb's eyes went to the packet. Marianne caught him. "I am following instructions. All of them. Most of the ones that are not insulting." He gave her a look. She gave it back. He almost smiled. Then the air shifted. Marianne lowered her eyes. "What happened with your meeting?" "Cancelled." The word sounded blunt in the warm kitchen. "Operation Harbor Light? They deploy before the next normal board date." Marianne gripped the edge of the counter. "Caleb, I am so sorry." "Don't. But if I had not been on that road, if I were back on that road right now, I would still stop." The answer came too quickly to be polite, too true to be softened. Marianne stared at him. Ranger sat between them, ears still. Something in Marianne's expression eased and hurt at the same time. "That is a costly kind of kindness." Caleb looked toward the window, where rain clung to the glass. "Maybe." She studied him a moment longer, then changed the subject with the grace of someone who knew when a wound had been touched enough. "Since you are here, you may as well let me feed you. I came to check on you, and I am checking whether you eat like a civilized person." "I had coffee." "That is not food. That is a mood." Ranger gave a soft huff, and Marianne pointed at him. "He agrees." Caleb ended up at her small kitchen table with scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee that tasted better than his. He noticed the back door sticking, the porch light hanging crooked, the garden fence sagging near the gate. Marianne noticed him noticing and told him not to start acting useful. He ignored that completely. By afternoon he had fixed the door and written down what he needed for the porch light. Marianne pretended to be annoyed. Ranger slept beneath the table as if he had known this house for years. When Caleb left, Marianne stood on the porch with a knitted shawl around her shoulders. The wind smelled of salt and wet grass. "You do not owe me visits," she said. Caleb opened the truck door. "I know. Then why come back?" He looked at Ranger, then at the porch light glowing pale in the damp afternoon. "Somebody should." Marianne did not answer. After Caleb's truck disappeared down the street, she remained on the porch long enough for the air to chill. Then she went inside, pulled an old address book from the living room shelf, and sat with it in her lap. Many names had been crossed out. Some had moved. Some had died. One name remained clear: Robert Hale. Marianne touched the page, thinking of her husband, the lost review, and the man who had said he would still stop. For the first time in years, she wondered if kindness might require her to become inconvenient too. Sunlight returned to Cape Charles, slowly spilling over the bay in pale gold and drying the rain from porch rails, church steps, and the white picket fences that lined the older streets. Caleb Turner began visiting Marianne Walker 3 mornings a week, though neither of them named the rhythm at first. Naming things made them easier to lose. On Mondays he checked the porch roof and replaced a loose board that had been letting rain leak into the entry. On Wednesdays he drove her to follow up appointments in Norfolk or across the water when the schedule demanded it. On Fridays he brought groceries because Marianne had proven she could not be trusted to call for help before attempting heroics with a shopping bag and one stubborn hip. Ranger made himself at home faster than Caleb did. The German Shepherd learned the path from the front door to the kitchen, the exact square of morning sun near Marianne's chair, and the shelf where she kept dog biscuits she claimed were for emergencies of morale. Caleb told her Ranger was a trained working dog and did not require morale biscuits. Marianne said all working men needed biscuits and looked directly at Caleb while saying it. That settled nothing except perhaps everything. The house changed by inches. The porch light worked. The garden gate stopped dragging. A dangerous throw rug disappeared from the hallway after Caleb stared at it for 6 full seconds. Marianne accused him of theft. He accused the rug of attempted murder. Ranger, who had watched Marianne catch her toe on it twice, sided with Caleb by lying on the rug until he could remove it. One afternoon, while Caleb searched the garage for a replacement hinge, he found an old military radio under a workbench. Dust covered the casing. The antenna hung loose. A faded strip of tape on the side read, David Walker, 1989. Marianne stood in the doorway with a dish towel in her hands. That thing has not worked in years. Caleb lifted it carefully. He used it. Every Sunday morning. Gospel station, country station, weather reports, sometimes static if he was feeling nostalgic. Her smile trembled but held. David said a house sounded less empty when voices came through the walls. Caleb carried the radio home. 3 nights later he returned with it tucked under one arm. Marianne met him in the kitchen, trying very hard not to look hopeful. You fixed it? I think so. That is a worrying phrase. Most honest ones are. He set the radio on the counter and turned the knob. Static crackled first, dry and stubborn. Then, a hymn rose through it, thin at the edges but clear enough. Marianne froze. The sound filled the kitchen softly, voices singing about mercy while sunlight rested on the floor. She turned away before Caleb could see her face. But he saw her shoulders move once. Ranger stood beside her and pressed his head against her knee. David played that one when he made pancakes, she said. Her voice was quiet, almost young. He burned them every time, said it was because he was listening too closely to the Lord. Caleb smiled. Was it? No. He was terrible at pancakes. The laugh that followed broke halfway into tears. Caleb did not move toward her. He had learned that some grief needed room to stand up before anyone tried to hold it. Later, they sat on the back porch with the radio playing through the open kitchen window. The garden smelled of wet soil, cut stems, and salt moving in from the bay. Marianne spoke about military life, but not the way most civilians did. She did not ask Caleb about gunfire, missions, or medals. She talked about absence, about waiting, about birthdays missed because ships changed plans, about sleeping badly until a car door closed in the driveway, about learning to cook for one while still setting 2 mugs out by accident. Caleb listened, because it sounded closer to truth than most speeches. Eventually, she asked about his parents. The question came gently, without hunger in it. For a long time he said nothing. Ranger rested at his feet, the dog's flank warm against his boot. Then Caleb told her about Tennessee, his father's old pickup, the drunk driver, the chaplain's call while Caleb was overseas, the connection cutting in and out. The funeral streamed over a military laptop that froze on his mother's framed photograph beside the casket. He told her about the voicemail he had never played. I tell myself I am saving it, he said. But really, I think I am afraid her voice will make it real. Marianne's hand settled over his, not dramatic, not pitying, just there. Love is already real, she said. That is why it hurts when we do not know where to put it. Caleb looked away toward the bay. The words landed somewhere guarded. They did not break the gate. They found the latch. That evening when he returned home, his own house felt different. Not full, not fixed, but less hostile in its quiet. He sat on the sofa intending to watch television. Ranger lay beside his feet. Rain began tapping the window after dark. Caleb closed his eyes for a minute. When dawn came, sunlight lay across the floor and Ranger was still beside him. Caleb had slept through the night without gunfire in his dreams, without the frozen funeral screen, without waking with his fists clenched. It was the first peaceful sleep he could remember in years. It did not solve his future. Operation Harbor Light was still the review was still gone, but something in his chest felt less alone. In Cape Charles, Marianne woke early too. She made coffee, turned on David's radio, and stared at the old address book on the table. One name waited there. Rear Admiral Robert Hale, retired. David's old friend, a man who disliked favors, loved facts, and had never forgiven a half-told story. Marianne picked up the phone. Her finger hovered over the number for a long time. Then she dialed. Norfolk wore the next morning in bright patches of sun and leftover rain, the streets shining as if the storm had washed them but forgotten to dry its hands. Marianne Walker sat across from Rear Admiral Robert Hale in a small seafood restaurant near the water, a place where old Navy men gathered because the coffee was strong. The booths were private enough, and the waitress knew when not to interrupt. Robert Hale was 82, with white hair, bent shoulders, and eyes still sharp enough to make younger officers check their posture from memory. He had served with David Walker decades earlier, and had remained his friend until the day David died. Marianne had not seen him in 3 years. That made the hug at the door shorter than it should have been, and longer than either of them expected. They ordered coffee. Robert waited. He had always been good at waiting. Marianne told him everything. The storm over the Chesapeake, Caleb's truck, the German shepherd who had seen her before Caleb allowed himself to stop, the hospital, the missed review, Operation Harbor Light, the way Caleb had said he would still stop if it happened again. Robert listened with his hands folded near his cup. He asked precise questions, times, locations, doctors, names, what the review was for, who chaired it, whether Caleb had called the office, whether the hospital had intake records. Marianne answered what she knew and admitted what she did not. When she finished, Robert stirred his coffee slowly. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Good. I do not want special treatment." "Better." His eyes stayed on hers. "Neither would the kind of man you are describing." Marianne looked down at her hands. They were older than she remembered some mornings. "I want someone to look at the whole story, not just the empty chair at the board table." Robert leaned back. Outside the window, gulls moved over the marina, white against the blue. "If the facts support it, I can ask that the facts be reviewed. That is all I want. No promises." David always said promises made before paperwork were usually theater. Robert smiled at that, and for 1 second she saw the younger man who had stood beside her husband in photographs. David was annoyingly right about many things. Over the next week, Marianne became more active than her cardiologist would have liked, though she did most of it from her kitchen table with tea, a legal pad, and Ranger's occasional supervision. Dr. Samuel Pierce confirmed the timing and condition from the first hospital visit. A nurse remembered Caleb arriving soaked through and refusing to leave until Marianne was stable. Hospital entry cameras showed him helping her through the emergency doors. Grace Holloway, the retired nurse 2 houses down, wrote a note about the storm and the dangerous stretch of road. Robert Hale made calls that sounded casual only to people who had never heard command authority wrapped in politeness. Caleb knew none of it. He kept visiting. He replaced the porch light, drove Marianne to a follow-up appointment, argued with her about sodium, and brought Ranger, who had begun treating the house like a post he had been assigned to guard. Caleb also began encouraging Marianne to call Claire. That went less smoothly. Claire Walker was Marianne's niece, 31, living in Richmond, and separated from her by a fight that had started with the old house, and ended with words neither woman knew how to unsay. Claire had wanted Marianne to move closer, or sell, or at least admit that living alone after heart problems was not noble. Marianne had heard accusation where fear had been. Pride had done the rest. One afternoon, Caleb found Marianne staring at Claire's number in the address book. "Call her. You sound bossy for a guest. I learned from you. That is unfair. I am charming." Ranger rested his head on Marianne's knee, eyes lifted. She tapped the page with one finger. "She thinks I pushed her away." Caleb sat across from her. "Did you? Perhaps. That is a yes in church clothes." Marianne gave him a look, then laughed, despite herself. The laugh faded. "What if she does not answer? Then you call again." "What if she does answer?" Caleb had no easy answer for that. "Then you tell the truth before pride gets organized." Marianne dialed later that night. The phone rang twice. Ranger sighed from the kitchen floor with such weary judgment that she pointed at him. "Do not start." 2 mornings later, Caleb was tightening the loose handrail on Marianne's porch when his phone rang. Naval Base. He stepped away from the drill and answered. The call lasted less than 4 minutes. Marianne watched from the doorway as his face changed. Not much. Caleb was not a man who let his face run loose, but something unguarded moved through his eyes. "What is it?" she asked. He lowered the phone slowly. "Special review. Tomorrow morning." Marianne gripped the doorframe. "Oh, Caleb. They reviewed additional information from the day I missed." "Did they?" Her voice was too innocent. He looked at her. She looked back badly. Ranger stood between them, tail moving once. Caleb narrowed his eyes. "Marianne, I may have spoken to someone who spoke to someone. An old friend of David's, Marianne. Do not use that tone with me. I am elderly, not defenseless." Caleb stared at her, then looked toward the bay, swallowing whatever rose in his throat. "You did not have to do that." "No," she said softly. "But somebody should have." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Marianne stepped onto the porch and hugged him before either of them could make the moment formal. Caleb stood stiff for half a second, then let one hand rest carefully against her back. Ranger leaned against both of them as if making the arrangement official. Tomorrow the door might open again for the first time in weeks. Caleb allowed himself to believe it. The evening before the special review arrived warm and clear, as if Virginia had decided to apologize for every storm it had thrown at Caleb Turner. Sunlight settled over Cape Charles in long gold bands, touching porch rails, garden leaves, and the blue water beyond the roofs. Marianne Walker sat outside with a light blanket over her knees, and 2 glasses of iced tea on the small table beside her chair. Caleb had come to tell her the details, though she already knew most of them because she had become, in her own words, a harmless old woman with a telephone, which Caleb was beginning to understand was one of the most dangerous creatures alive. Ranger sprawled near the porch steps, head up, watching gulls as if he suspected them of federal crimes. Caleb stood at the railing for a while. The special review was set for 0900 the next morning at Little Creek. A smaller board, but official. If the recommendation came through quickly, there was still a narrow chance he and Ranger could join the final harbor, light staging rotation. Not the full role he had trained for, maybe, but enough to matter, enough to serve. "You are thinking too loudly," Marianne said. Caleb glanced back. "That a medical diagnosis? A widow diagnosis? We get good at reading men who pretend their faces are furniture." He almost smiled. "I am fine. That is furniture speaking." Ranger thumped his tail once. Marianne pointed at him. "He agrees." Caleb sat in the other chair. The porch boards were warm beneath his boots. The air smelled of salt, tea, and roses recovering from rain. For an hour, they talked about everything except the review. Marianne told him about David preaching once on a destroyer during such rough seas that half the sailors looked ready to meet the Lord immediately. Caleb told her about Ranger finding contraband snacks in a training locker and sitting beside the evidence with more pride than remorse. Marianne laughed so hard she had to press a hand to her chest, which made Caleb sit straighter. She waved him down. "I am laughing, not expiring. Those can look similar with you, rude." The laughter settled into quiet across the street. Grace Holloway watered her potted herbs and pretended not to watch them. The town's church bell rang 6 times, soft and old. Marianne looked toward the water. David used to say God rarely gives us the map, usually just the next turn. Caleb thought of the bridge, the rain, the moment he had turned the truck around. The next turn can be expensive. Yes, she looked at him, but the wrong road can cost more. He did not answer. She reached for her tea. Her hand shook slightly, not from cold. Caleb saw it, and she saw him see it. "I took my medicine," she said. "I did not ask. Your eyebrows did. My eyebrows are classified. They are loud. I called Claire again today." Caleb looked at her. Did you hang up? Not immediately. Progress. It went to voicemail. Did you leave one? Marianne's mouth tightened. No. Caleb leaned back. Also progress, but smaller. She sighed. I do not know how to begin. Begin badly. That is your advice. Most important things begin badly. She stared at him for a second, then nodded. Your mother raised you that sensible? The question landed gently but deep. Caleb looked down at his hands. She tried. Marianne's voice softened. What was her name? Linda. Tell me one thing about Linda. He almost retreated. Ranger's eyes moved to him. The porch stayed quiet. Caleb breathed once. She mailed socks every deployment. Thick ones, terrible colors. Said if I insisted on going to dangerous places, at least my feet should be embarrassing. Marianne laughed softly. I would have liked her. She would have liked you. He said it before he could guard it. Marianne blinked, and the evening seemed to pause around them. When she spoke again, her voice was careful. Go do what you are meant to do tomorrow. Caleb looked toward the road. If something happens, Caleb, if it does. I have Grace. I have my doctor. I have a phone that will remain charged if I must tape it to my hand to satisfy you. She smiled, but her eyes were bright. Do not worry about Mom. The word came out naturally, almost absent-mindedly. Then it hung in the air. Mom, Marianne heard it. Caleb heard it. Ranger lifted his head. For a second, Caleb froze as if the porch boards had shifted under him. Marianne looked embarrassed, emotional, and stubborn all at once. I am sorry. Caleb looked away toward the bay, where a boat horn sounded low in the distance. His voice came out quieter than he expected. Neither of them spoke for a while after that. The sun slipped lower. Shadows lengthened across the yard. When Caleb finally stood to leave, Marianne rose too, ignoring his automatic motion to help until she wobbled enough for him to justify taking her elbow. Medication, he said. Yes. Doctor next month. Yes. If the Buick dies again, it will not. Grace threatened it. Call someone. Marianne rolled her eyes. Yes, sir. Ranger climbed into the truck, then looked back at the porch. Marianne lifted one hand. Caleb started the engine. As he pulled away, he saw her in the mirror, small beneath the porch light, one hand resting on the rail. He did not know that inside the house, on the table beside David's old radio, sat a legal pad full of names, numbers, dates, and notes from every call she had made. He only knew that the word Mom had found the air between them and had not sounded wrong. That night, Caleb barely slept. Not from nightmares. From hope, which turned out to be just as restless.
Morning came clear over Chesapeake, with a pale blue sky and sunlight flashing on puddles left from the week of rain. For once, the roads seemed willing to cooperate. Caleb Turner was dressed before dawn, his black jacket folded neatly on the passenger seat, his review documents stacked in a folder beside the console, and coffee cooling untouched in the cup holder. Ranger sat in the back seat, brushed and alert, wearing his working harness like he understood the day had weight. The drive toward Little Creek Fort Story felt almost too smooth. Traffic lights turned green one after another. Trucks stayed in their lanes. The road ahead opened straight and bright. Caleb kept one hand on the wheel and one thumb near the edge of the folder, touching it now and then, as if making sure the opportunity remained real. He had spent nearly 2 years getting back to this point. Rehab, evaluations, honest conversations he would rather have avoided. Mornings when his body could do the work but his mind returned to old rooms, old calls, old guilt. He had learned to stand in front of doctors and officers and say the true thing without dressing it up. He was not the man he had been before loss and trauma. Maybe that was not failure. Maybe that was the point. The phone rang at 8:11. Unknown number. Caleb almost let it go. Almost. Something in Ranger shifted before Caleb touched the button. The German Shepherd rose in the back seat, ears forward. Caleb answered, "Turner." A woman's voice came through, breathless and strained. "Caleb?" "This is Grace Holloway." "I live 2 houses down from Marianne." His grip tightened on the wheel. "What happened?" "I found her in the garden. She collapsed. The ambulance is here now." For a second, the road became too bright. "Is she conscious?" "Not when I found her. She was breathing hard. They are taking her to Riverside Shore. I thought you should know." The traffic light ahead turned red. Caleb stopped. The base road stretched forward beyond the intersection, clean and direct. The Special Review Board would be assembling. Commander Ellis would be there. The second chance Marianne had fought for, quietly and stubbornly, waited less than 30 minutes away. Ranger stood fully now, staring through the side window toward the turn that led back across the water. His body was still, but every part of him was waiting. The light turned green. Cars moved around Caleb. Someone tapped a horn behind him. Grace's voice trembled through the speaker. "Caleb?" Memories rose fast. His mother's photograph frozen on a bad military feed. A funeral he never reached. The old phone in a drawer. A funeral he never reached. The voicemail still unheard. Loss had a cruel talent for entering through ordinary doors. Caleb looked at the road toward the base. Then, at Ranger in the mirror. The decision took less than a second. His hand turned the wheel. The truck moved left, away from the base, toward the highway that would take him to Marianne. While he drove, he called the evaluation office. The administrator who answered sounded stunned before she sounded angry. "Turner, the board is already assembling." "I know. This is the special session." "I know. You understand what missing it means." Caleb glanced at Ranger, who had settled but remained upright, eyes fixed ahead. "Yes." Silence came through the line. Then a long breath. "What should I tell Commander Ellis?" "Tell him Marianne Walker is in an ambulance, and I am going to the hospital." The administrator was quiet for a second. "We'll document it." That was all she could promise. Caleb thanked her and ended the call. 40 minutes later, Riverside Shore Memorial Hospital rose ahead, low and bright under the morning sun. Caleb parked badly, corrected badly, and gave up. Ranger jumped down beside him, close but not crowding. The emergency department smelled of coffee, disinfectant, damp jackets, and fear that had learned to sit in chairs. Grace Holloway stood near the check-in desk. A small woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair, a raincoat over scrubs, though she was retired, and the practical expression of someone who had spent a lifetime refusing panic, until panic became useful. She was watering the roses, Grace said, before Caleb could ask. "Stubborn woman." "I told her last week those roses could survive one morning without supervision." "Did she hit her head?" "No. I was close enough to see her go down." "Go." "Paramedics think cardiac rhythm." Caleb nodded because nodding was easier than letting the room see his hands. They waited. Ranger lay beside the row of chairs, head on paws, eyes never leaving the doors. People glanced at the dog, but did not approach. Something in Caleb's face discouraged small talk. Nearly an hour later, Dr. Karen Lowell came out, a calm woman in her early 60s with kind eyes, silver hair pinned back, and a voice that made facts feel survivable. "Caleb Turner." He stood too fast. "How is she?" "Awake." The word loosened something in his chest. She had a cardiac rhythm disturbance that caused her to lose consciousness. It was serious, but Grace found her quickly. Treatment started quickly. Timing mattered. Timing. It always did. A few minutes later, Caleb entered Marianne's room. She lay propped against pillows, pale but very much alive. The first thing she did was point at him. That was how Caleb knew she was improving. "What are you doing here?" She demanded. "You collapsed. You had a review. So did you." Mine was not scheduled. Her eyes flashed. "That is not funny. It was not meant to be." Ranger moved to the doorway and sat, guarding the room with quiet authority. Marianne looked from the dog to Caleb and back again. "You should have gone." Caleb stepped closer. "No, Caleb, no." The word landed firm enough to end the argument, though Marianne looked ready to appeal to a higher court. For a while, only the heart monitor spoke. Sunlight filtered through the blinds. Caleb stood beside the bed, trying not to stare at the IV line, the monitor, the fragile blue vein under Marianne's skin. She looked toward the window. Her voice changed. "This is my fault. No. Yes. No. I called people." Caleb went still. Marianne closed her eyes, then opened them with the weary courage of a woman choosing confession over pride. Robert Hale. The hospital. Nurses. Records. I wanted them to know what really happened that morning. Caleb stared at her. Outside the room, a cart rolled softly down the hall. Inside, the small machine beside her bed kept steady time. "You did all that?" he asked. Marianne nodded. "Because somebody should have." The words entered him quietly. That made them worse. Caleb had known. Duty, command, brotherhood, obligation. He had known people who would risk themselves because the mission required it. But this was different. Marianne had spent her strength on him for no rank, no order, no debt, no expectation. Care, bare, and stubborn. His throat tightened. He looked away toward the window, where the morning sun lay across the sill like a hand. For years he had kept distance between himself and love, because love could be taken by a drunk driver, a bad connection, a frozen funeral screen. Marianne reached across the bed rail and touched his arm. Simple. Enough. "You did not have to," he said, his voice rough. "I know." "Then why?" She smiled gently, because somebody should have. He looked at her then, really looked. The old woman from the rain. The widow with the radio. The porch light. The tea. The word that had slipped out the evening before. This time, it did not slip. "Mom," Caleb said. Marianne froze. Marianne froze. Tears filled her eyes at once. Not dramatic tears, but the kind that arrive when something lost hears its name from another room. Ranger stayed at the doorway, still and solemn, as if guarding the moment from the rest of the world. Caleb sat beside the bed and took her hand. The review was gone again. Maybe the mission too. But for the first time in many years, Caleb did not feel like he was standing alone in the ruins of a future. He felt like someone had left a porch light on. The hospital room stayed quiet after Caleb called Marianne Mom. But it was not the empty kind of quiet. It had breath in it. Sunlight moved across the wall in slow bands. The heart monitor kept its steady rhythm, and Ranger remained near the doorway with his head raised, watching every nurse and doctor, as if the room had become his official post. Marianne held Caleb's hand longer than either of them mentioned. At last, she wiped her cheeks with the edge of the sheet and tried to gather her dignity. "Well," she said, voice unsteady. I suppose if you are going to call me that, you should stop scowling at my IV bag. Caleb looked at the clear line above her bed. It looks suspicious. It is saline. Suspicious saline. She laughed, and the laugh shook, but it was real. Dr. Karen Lowell kept Marianne overnight for observation. Grace brought a sweater and a list of things Marianne had been forbidden to do, which Caleb accepted with grim approval and Marianne called a conspiracy of bossy people. Ranger was allowed to stay for part of the afternoon after a nurse recognized the calmest dog in the building and quietly decided rules had room for mercy. By evening, Caleb stepped outside to call Commander Ellis. He expected formality. He expected disappointment. He did not expect the long silence after he explained. "Turner," Ellis said at last, "you are developing a reputation for impossible mornings." "Yes, sir. I spoke with the administrator. The board could not stay." "Understood. Harbor Light is closed." The words hurt. Not like before. Not as a collapse. More like a door shutting somewhere down a hall. Caleb watched an ambulance pull into the bay, lights flashing without siren. "Understood." Ellis's voice softened just enough. "This does not end your file. It changes the timeline." Ellis's voice softened just enough. "We will revisit in the fall cycle." Caleb closed his eyes. "Thank you, sir. Do not thank me yet. Keep training. Keep your records clean." "And Turner?" "Sir?" "Most men say people come first. Twice now. You have proved you mean it. That will matter to the right role, even if it costs you the wrong one." Caleb stood with the phone in his hand after the call ended, feeling the sentence settle beside the loss. The right role. He did not know what that meant. For the first time, he wondered if not knowing was not the same as failing. The next morning brought another surprise. Claire Walker arrived from Richmond just before noon, wearing navy slacks, a cream blouse, and the tense expression of someone who had rehearsed many speeches in the car and trusted none of them. She was 31, with Marianne's pale blue eyes and the cautious posture of a woman who expected old pain to rise from the floorboards. Caleb met her in the hall. "Claire?" "Yes." She looked at Ranger first, because most people did. "You must be Caleb." "I am." "And that is Ranger?" Ranger sat. Claire almost smiled. Aunt Marianne mentioned he was serious. "He tries. Do you think she will be angry I came?" Caleb looked through the room window. Marianne was sitting upright, pretending not to watch the hallway. "Yes." Claire's face fell. "Oh. That does not mean she does not want you here." Claire let out a breath that shook. "We had a fight." "So I heard." "She told you?" "Enough." Claire looked toward the room, eyes bright. "I wanted her to move closer. She thought I wanted to sell the house. I said things badly. She heard them worse. Then months went by, and after a while, silence starts acting like a wall you need permission to climb." Caleb thought of his mother's voicemail. "Climb badly." Claire looked at him. "What?" "Important things usually start badly." Ranger huffed softly, as if endorsing the doctrine. Claire wiped at one eye and entered. Marianne saw her and lifted her chin, ready to defend herself with pride. "Then," Claire said, "I was scared." The words were so plain, they disarmed the room. Marianne's mouth trembled. So was I. That was the beginning. Not a perfect reconciliation. No music swelled. No old wound politely vanished. Claire sat beside the bed and asked about medication. Marianne accused her of using a nurse voice. Claire said she was not a nurse. She just knew nonsense when she heard it. Marianne called that genetic. Caleb stood near the door with Ranger and watched two stubborn women find their way back through small, practical things. Pills, garden soil, the Buick, the radio, a soup Claire had once made so badly that David Walker had prayed over it twice. By afternoon, they were laughing. Carefully, but laughing. Several days later, Marianne returned home with new medication, stricter instructions, Claire staying for the week, and Caleb conducting inspections with a seriousness that made Grace say he had missed his calling as a porch dictator. The house felt different. Not less old, less alone. Claire opened windows. Marianne complained about the draft. Ranger moved between rooms, approving the new order. One evening, after Claire had gone to buy groceries and Marianne napped in her chair, Caleb sat on the porch, with Ranger at his feet and the old phone in his hand. The phone had been in a drawer for 6 years. Its battery was weak, its case cracked, its memory full of things he had refused to touch. He had told Marianne about the voicemail. She had not pressed. That was why he could finally press play. His mother's voice came through small and warm, weathered by time and cheap speakers. "Hey, baby. I know you cannot say where you are, but your father says tell you the truck still starts, which means miracles continue. I mailed socks again. Do not complain. Eat something green when you can. We love you. Come home safe." The message ended with a click. Caleb sat very still. His hands shook, not from cold. Ranger put his head on Caleb's knee. Caleb bent over the dog and let the tears come quietly. The voicemail had not destroyed him. It had opened a room he had kept locked too long. When Claire returned, she saw his face and did not ask. She simply set a grocery bag down inside and left him the mercy of privacy. In the weeks that followed, Caleb trained, visited, repaired, drove, and listened. The old mission was gone, but life had not emptied out around it. Commander Ellis sent one brief message near the end of summer. Full review cycle confirmed. Potential instructor, advisor track. Details pending. Caleb read it twice. Ranger leaned against his leg. From inside Marianne's house, Claire and Marianne argued over whether tomato soup required basil. David's radio played softly in the kitchen. Caleb looked at the message again and felt something unexpected. Not disappointment. Not relief, exactly. A question. What if the new road was not smaller? What if it was simply the one that had room for the man he had become? Autumn arrived in Virginia Beach, with bright water, cooler wind, and leaves gathering in gold patches near the base roads. The air near Little Creek Fort Story smelled of salt, diesel, wet grass, and the faint metallic edge that always lived around military buildings. Caleb Turner walked into the evaluation center with Ranger at his left and a folder under his arm. This time, he was not racing a storm. This time, he was not soaked through or carrying the shock of a hospital hallway in his chest. Still, his hands felt too aware of themselves. The boardroom looked different in autumn light, less like judgment, more like a place where facts had finally learned to sit still. Commander Mark Ellis was there, along with 2 officers Caleb recognized from prior reviews, a psychologist in a Navy blazer and a senior enlisted canine program manager whose eyes went first to Ranger, then to Caleb. That alone made Caleb like him. The questions came direct. Physical readiness, sleep patterns, therapy continuity, medication, deployment tolerance, canine handling, emergency judgment. Caleb answered without polishing the truth until it shone falsely. He told them he still had hard nights, fewer than before. He told them he still checked exits, probably always would. He told them he had missed 2 review sessions because 2 medical emergencies had crossed his path, and both times he had chosen the person in front of him. No one rushed to fill the silence after that. Ranger lay at Caleb's boots, calm enough to make the room feel steadier. The psychologist looked over her notes. 2 years ago, you described purpose almost entirely through deployment readiness. Caleb remembered the room, the fluorescent light, the taste of stale coffee, his own voice giving answers that were true but incomplete. Yes, ma'am. How would you describe purpose now? He looked down at Ranger. The dog's amber eyes lifted. Caleb thought of Marianne's porch, Claire washing teacups badly to hide tears, his mother's voicemail, and the way Commander Ellis had said the right role might notice the right things, showing up. Caleb said, "For the mission when it is mine. For people when they are in front of me. For the dog who usually knows before I do." The senior canine manager's mouth twitched. "They do that." "Yes, sir." The room breathed. The review lasted 90 minutes. When Caleb stepped outside afterward, sunlight struck the wet pavement. Ranger shook once, tags chiming. Caleb did not know what the board would decide, but he knew something had changed. He had not begged the old life to take him back. He had brought the life he had now and let them decide whether there was room for it. 3 weeks later, the decision came. Caleb stood in Marianne's kitchen when the phone rang. Marianne sat at the table pretending to read a magazine upside down. Claire chopped carrots at the counter, with more force than carrots deserved. Ranger had positioned himself between Caleb and the refrigerator, perhaps out of loyalty, perhaps because Marianne kept biscuits there. Commander Ellis did not waste words. Approved. Caleb closed his eyes. Claire froze with the knife in her hand. Marianne lowered the magazine. Not as a deploying operator. Ellis continued. Tactical canine instructor and operational advisor. Little Creek. Regional readiness. Humanitarian response planning. Canine integration. You will train teams that deploy, and you will advise when needed. Occasional travel, not constant rotation. Caleb opened his eyes. Outside, wind moved through the rose bushes. Yes, sir. It is not the path you were chasing. Caleb looked at Marianne, who had one hand pressed to her mouth. No, sir. You still want it. Ranger leaned against Caleb's leg, solid and warm. Yes, sir, I do. The call ended after logistics, start dates, paperwork, and a warning from Ellis that instructors worked harder than operators, because operators only had to survive their own mistakes. Caleb set the phone down. For once, no one spoke. Then Marianne stood with both hands on the table. Well? Approved. Claire let out something between a laugh and a sob. Marianne's eyes filled. Oh, Caleb. Instructor and advisor. Close to Little Creek. Marianne came around the table. Slower than emotion wanted, but faster than her doctor would have preferred. Caleb met her halfway. She hugged him fiercely for a woman who claimed to be fragile, only when it helped her win arguments. Ranger circled them once, then pressed his shoulder into both their legs. Claire wiped her face with the back of her hand and said, I am not crying. The carrots are aggressive. Marianne laughed. The radio on the shelf crackled softly. David's old gospel station fading in and out behind them. The house seemed to hold the sound differently now. Not as an echo of someone gone, but as part of the living day. In the weeks that followed, Caleb began teaching at Little Creek. The younger handlers watched him carefully at first, measuring the former seal, the German shepherd. the file history they probably thought they knew. Caleb gave them no speeches about bravery. He taught leash discipline, search patterns, environmental awareness, canine stress signals, and the quiet art of trusting a partner who could not explain himself in words. When a young handler got frustrated because his dog kept alerting on the wrong corner of a training structure, Caleb said, "Do not assume the dog is wrong just because you are embarrassed." The dog was not wrong. The handler learned. Ranger enjoyed the work, though he seemed personally offended by rookies who dropped treats or failed to read ears. Caleb came home tired in a clean way. Some evenings he drove to Cape Charles. Sometimes Claire was there, grading paperwork from her nursing program prerequisites at Marianne's table, because she had decided life was short and excuses were boring. Sometimes Grace came over and told everyone what they were doing wrong with the authority of a retired nurse and a woman who had earned the right. The family formed in practical ways: medication charts, grocery lists, a new railing on the porch, emergency numbers taped near the phone, Ranger's bed placed in the kitchen and ignored because he preferred Marianne's feet. One Sunday after lunch, Caleb stood in the living room while Marianne turned on David's radio. A hymn rose through static. Claire came to stand beside them. Marianne took her niece's hand. Caleb did not move away when her other hand found his. The song filled the little house near the water, and Caleb understood something he could not have understood on the morning of the storm. The life he lost was real. The life he had found was real, too. One did not cancel the other. One had somehow made room for the other to breathe. Winter brushed the Chesapeake coast lightly that year, with cold mornings, silver grass, and gulls that complained over the water as if weather were a personal insult. Caleb Turner settled into his role at Little Creek, the way a man settles into a pair of boots that are not new, but finally fit. He trained handlers before sunrise, reviewed humanitarian response plans after lunch, and spent late afternoons walking training grounds with Ranger moving at his side like a shadow with opinions. The work mattered. That surprised him more than it should have. He had feared that not deploying constantly would feel like being shelved. Instead, he found himself watching younger operators grow steadier, watching dogs learn to trust new hands, watching plans become cleaner because someone in the room had lived through the cost of confusion. He was useful. Not in the old way. In a way that did not require him to disappear from every person who loved him. Marianne approved, though she expressed approval by criticizing his lunch choices and telling Ranger confidentially that Caleb would live longer if he stopped treating black coffee like a food group. Claire visited Cape Charles every other weekend at first, then more often. Her Richmond apartment remained, but a bag of her clothes appeared in Marianne's guest room. Then nursing textbooks, then a mug with a chipped handle she insisted was lucky. Marianne called this clutter. Claire called it presence. Caleb called it better than silence, and was ignored by both women. The old fight about selling the house did not vanish. It changed shape. Claire no longer spoke as if moving Marianne would solve fear. Marianne no longer heard every concern as an attempt to erase David. They began talking about repairs, safety, maybe a downstairs bathroom remodel, maybe a medical alert system that Marianne called an electronic tattletale. Grace volunteered to help research options and immediately became unbearable with pamphlets. Ranger loved the pamphlets because one fell on the floor and became his. Caleb's own house changed too. The old phone with his mother's voicemail no longer lived hidden in a drawer. He copied the message, saved it, and then one evening played it while sitting at his kitchen table with Ranger at his feet. He cried again, but not as if the grief had ambushed him. More as if it had been invited in, given a chair, and told it could stay without running the house. On Linda Turner's birthday, Caleb drove to Tennessee. It was the first time he had visited his parents' graves without feeling as though his ribs were full of broken glass. He brought flowers, stood between the two stones, and told them about Marianne. He told them about Ranger, though his mother would have asked more questions about whether the dog was eating enough. He told them about the new assignment. He told them he was sorry he had not made it home. The wind moved through the cemetery grass. No answer came. But for once the silence did not feel like punishment. When he returned to Virginia, he drove straight to Cape Charles. Marianne opened the door before he knocked, as if she had been listening for the truck. She did not ask how it went. She only held out her arms. Caleb stepped into them. Some things did not need a report. That evening, Claire made soup. It was much better than the infamous soup David had once prayed over twice, though Marian said the bar had been buried in the yard. Ranger slept under the table with one paw resting against Caleb's boot. After dinner, Caleb took a folder from his truck and brought it inside. Marianne was in her chair, glasses low on her nose. Claire sat on the sofa with a blanket tucked around her legs. The radio played softly from the kitchen. More base paperwork. Claire asked. Some. Caleb sat across from Marianne. His hands were steady, but his chest was not. There are forms for emergency contact authorization, dependent care coordination, medical release permissions. Some legal, some base-related, some civilian. Nothing has to happen tonight. Marianne narrowed her eyes. You are talking like a man approaching a skittish horse. I have met you. Fair. Claire leaned forward, suddenly quiet. Caleb opened the folder. I cannot get my parents back. The room changed. Even the radio seemed to lower itself. Marianne's face softened. Caleb looked at her, then at Claire, because this mattered to both of them now. I know family is not paperwork. I know a signature does not make love real. But paperwork keeps hospitals from guessing. It keeps the wrong people from making calls. It gives the right people a place to stand when things get hard. Marianne's hand moved to her throat. Caleb continued before courage could leak out of him. If you are willing, I would like you listed as family. Emergency contact, care authorization, all of it. And not because I think you need to be managed. He gave her a small look. Though you do. Marianne made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob. I would like to spend the rest of my life calling you Mom. Claire covered her mouth. Marianne stared at him as if he had placed something impossible and holy on the table. Tears filled her eyes. This time she did not hide them. Caleb, you can say no. Do not be ridiculous. I had to offer the exit. You and your exits. She reached across the table and took his hand. Her fingers were thin, warm, and stronger than they looked. Yes. Ranger rose and came to her chair, resting his head in her lap. Marianne laughed through tears. And you approve? Ranger sighed, deeply, as if approval had been obvious for months. Claire came around the sofa and knelt beside Marianne, one arm around her shoulders. For a moment, the three of them stayed that way, while the old radio hummed softly in the kitchen, and the winter wind moved around the house. Not blood, not obligation, not a replacement for what had been lost. Something different. Something chosen. Caleb had spent years thinking family was a place a man could arrive too late and lose forever. Now, in a small house near the bay, with Ranger leaning against his leg and Marianne's hand holding his, he learned that sometimes family was also a porch light, someone turned on after dark, just in case you were still trying to find the road. Spring came to Cape Charles with yellow flowers in the roadside grass, bright wind off the bay, and gulls stepping through parking lots like they owned deeds to the town. Marianne Walker's garden recovered in stubborn bursts. The roses Caleb had once found beaten down by rain now climbed the fence in red and pink flames, tied carefully to new supports that Claire claimed looked professional and Marianne claimed looked bossy. Caleb suspected both were true. Life did not become simple. That was not how life worked. Marianne still had cardiology appointments. Caleb still had hard nights, though fewer. Claire still drove back to Richmond when work required it, then returned with laundry, groceries, and stories about classmates, young enough to make her feel ancient at 31. Grace still appeared at inconvenient times with helpful information and no respect for denial. Ranger still believed every medical professional entering Marianne's house needed to be inspected for moral character. But the shape of things had changed. The house no longer sounded like one woman waiting for old footsteps. It sounded like Claire dropping keys in the wrong bowl, Caleb fixing something he had not been asked to fix, Ranger's nails clicking across wood, Marianne turning on David's radio every Sunday morning. The old grief remained in the rooms, but it no longer sat in every chair. At Little Creek, Caleb became known as the instructor who could make a handler redo a drill 6 times without raising his voice and somehow make it feel worse than yelling. The younger operators respected him, partly because of his record, partly because Ranger clearly did, and partly because Caleb never pretended courage was clean. Your dog reads what your ego misses. He told a class one morning after a trainee ignored a stress signal from a young shepherd. Pay attention before the dog has to embarrass you. The young shepherd immediately sat on the trainee's boot. Ranger looked away, professional enough not to laugh. Caleb almost failed at the same standard. Commander Ellis visited the training field in April. He watched Caleb run a scenario involving collapsed structures, flood noise, and civilian evacuation. Afterward, he walked beside Caleb toward the kennels. You look settled. Caleb glanced at him. That an insult, sir? For some men, maybe. Ellis watched Ranger trot ahead. For you, no. Caleb did not answer. Ellis stopped near the fence. Harbor Light did good work. You should know that. I followed the reports. I figured. Caleb looked across the field, where 2 younger handlers were packing gear. I still wish I had been there. Of course you do. Ellis's voice was level. You can grieve the door that closed without pretending the one that opened is smaller. Caleb thought of Marianne's kitchen, Claire's laugh, his mother's voicemail. And the forms now filed, in all the places forms needed to be filed. Learning that. Good. Ellis nodded once and left him with the kind of approval that did not need ceremony. That weekend, Caleb, Claire, Marianne, Grace, and Ranger went to the small church near the water where David Walker had once helped lead veterans' prayer breakfasts. Marianne had avoided the building for years, not because she had lost faith, but because some pews were too full of ghosts. Caleb did not push. Claire did not push. Ranger, who was not invited into the sanctuary but had been granted special permission for the outdoor memorial garden, sat beside Marianne under a live oak while the bells rang. She held David's old prayer book in her lap. I used to think coming back here would mean letting him go, she said. Caleb stood beside her. Does it? She looked toward the church doors, where Claire was speaking with the pastor. No. I think it means letting him come with me differently. Ranger rested his chin on her knee. Marianne smiled. He would have liked this dog. He had good taste. He married me. Fair evidence. She laughed, and the sound moved through the garden with the bells. Later that day, Claire pulled Caleb aside, while Marianne spoke with Grace. "Thank you." Caleb looked uncomfortable immediately. For what? For stopping in the rain. He looked toward Marianne. "Ranger started it. I know." Claire smiled. "Thank him too." She grew serious. "I kept thinking there would be time. Time to apologize. Time to visit. Time for her to call me first so I did not have to feel like the one who cared more." Then she collapsed, and suddenly time looked like a very stupid thing to gamble with. Caleb nodded. "It is. You learnt that the hard way. Most things I know came that way." Claire touched his arm. "You brought her back to me." Caleb shook his head. "You came back. Because you kept the door from closing." He did not know what to do with that, so he looked at Ranger. Ranger was rolling discreetly in a patch of grass with no dignity whatsoever. "He is the better one," Caleb said. Claire laughed. "Obviously." Summer approached, and with it came a base family day. Caleb almost skipped it. Then Marianne found out and informed him that if he was going to be publicly useful, his family had a right to inspect the premises. Claire agreed. Grace invited herself. Ranger looked pleased, though Ranger looked pleased about any plan involving vehicles and admiration. On the day itself, the sky was blue, flags snapped in the wind, and the training field filled with families, dogs, handlers, children, and the smell of grilled food. Caleb demonstrated canine search patterns with Ranger, who performed flawlessly until a toddler dropped a hot dog bun near the cone line. Ranger glanced at Caleb. Caleb said, "Leave it." Ranger left it with the tragic dignity of a saint denied martyrdom. Marianne applauded like he had won a medal. Claire took photos. Grace told a lieutenant his sunscreen application was inadequate. Caleb stood afterward with his unlikely family near the fence and felt the old ache in him shift. Not vanish. Shift. For years he had believed the best he could do was survive what he had lost and return to the exact life that gave him structure. Now he understood structure was not the same as shelter. Mission was not the same as meaning. And sometimes the road that seemed to take a man away from his future was the road that finally brought him home. Late summer settled over Cape Charles in warm salt air, humming cicadas and porch light that came on before dark, because Marianne Walker liked the way it looked through the front windows. The roses along the fence were heavy with bloom. The old Buick had finally been retired after Grace threatened to report it for emotional cruelty. Claire's lucky chipped mug now lived permanently in Marianne's kitchen cabinet. Ranger's bed remained in the corner and remained mostly unused, because Ranger preferred the rug beside Marianne's chair or the space under Caleb's boots. Caleb Turner arrived one Friday evening with groceries, base paperwork, and a tiredness that felt honest. He had spent the day training young handlers on flood response search patterns, correcting leash work, and watching Ranger demonstrate patience with humans who did not deserve him. The work left dust on Caleb's boots and satisfaction in his bones. Marianne sat on the porch with a quilt over her knees despite the warm air. "You are late," she said, "by 4 minutes. Standards matter. I brought peaches. Forgiven." Claire came out with iced tea, and Grace appeared from next door, because somehow the word peaches had crossed property lines. They ate on the porch while the sky turned pink over the bay. Ranger rested his head on Marianne's knee until she surrendered a small piece of biscuit she claimed had fallen by divine accident. Caleb did not challenge the theology. After dinner, Marianne asked for the radio. Caleb brought it from the kitchen and set it on the porch table. Static crackled, then an old gospel song came through, soft and clear. For a while, nobody talked. Claire leaned against the railing. Grace rocked in the old chair David had once repaired badly and proudly. Caleb sat on the porch step, with Ranger pressed against his side. Marianne looked around at them all, and her eyes shone. "This house was very quiet before you two broke into it," she said. Caleb glanced at Ranger. "He broke in first. I remember. He has a history." Ranger sighed as if burdened by false accusations. Marianne touched the dog's head. "Good thing." The words were light. The meaning under them was not. Caleb thought back to the bridge, the rain, the marker post, the clock on the dashboard. He thought of the first review room sitting empty, the second review lost to a hospital call. The road he had believed was closing forever. He thought of his mother's voicemail, played now often enough that the sound brought tears sometimes, but not terror. He thought of his father's grave, David's radio, Claire's first awkward hospital visit, and Marianne saying, "Do not worry about Mom," before either of them knew the word had already chosen a place to land. "I used to think being late was the worst thing," Caleb said. The women looked at him. He kept his eyes on the bay. "Late to the funeral, late to the people who needed me, late to whatever version of myself I was supposed to become." Ranger shifted closer. Caleb rested a hand on the dog's neck. "Turns out the worst thing is driving past when you know you should stop." Marianne reached down and touched his shoulder. Claire wiped at her face and blamed the wind, though there was no wind worth blaming. Grace, mercifully, said nothing. The porch light glowed behind them, warm and steady. In the months that followed, the chosen family became ordinary, in the way miracles become ordinary when they are allowed to stay. Caleb's name appeared on Marianne's emergency forms. Marianne's number sat at the top of Caleb's contact list. Claire split her time between Richmond and Cape Charles until the split began leaning more toward Cape Charles. Grace continued monitoring everyone with retired nurse authority. Ranger developed a following among Caleb's trainees, several neighborhood children, and one deeply suspicious cat across the street. Caleb kept teaching. Sometimes he advised on response plans for storms in places he would never see. Sometimes teams he trained deployed without him, and he felt the old pull. But he no longer mistook longing for proof that his life was wrong. When hurricanes threatened the coast, he worked late at Little Creek, then drove to Cape Charles to check shutters, medications, batteries, and Marianne's pantry, which somehow contained enough canned soup to outlast civilization. Marianne complained about his fussing, then asked if he had eaten. Claire rolled her eyes and made sandwiches. Ranger patrolled the hallway like a serious gentleman. On the anniversary of the morning in the rain, Caleb drove Marianne across the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel. The weather was clear, the water blue, the guardrails dry. He pulled carefully onto a scenic overlook near the place where everything had changed. Marianne stood beside him, one hand on her cane, the other resting on Ranger's head. "I was very foolish," she said. "Yes." She looked at him. "You are supposed to soften that. You told me standards matter." She laughed. The sound lifted into the salt air. Caleb smiled toward the road. "I almost did not stop." Marianne's laughter faded, but her face stayed kind. "But you did." Ranger did. "No," Ranger noticed. "You chose." Caleb let that settle. Cars passed behind them, people going somewhere urgent, somewhere ordinary, somewhere they might not remember by evening. He looked down at Ranger, then at Marianne, and felt the strange peace of a life he could not have planned, not through blood. Not through obligation, through decisions made in rain, in hospital rooms, on porches, beside radios, under the steady gaze of a dog who refused to let a man ignore what mattered. That evening, back at the house, they left the porch light on long after sunset. Not because anyone was lost, because once they all had been. And now they knew the way home. Sometimes grace does not arrive as thunder, certainty, or a perfect plan. Sometimes it arrives as a delay, a flat tire, a phone call, a stranger on the roadside, or a loyal dog who will not let you keep driving past the right thing. Many of us carry grief over moments when we were too late, too far away, or too afraid to say what love needed to hear. But life, by God's mercy, still gives us chances to show up. A family can be born from kindness. A heart can reopen after loss. A porch light can become a promise. If this story touched your heart, comment Amen and share it with someone who needs hope tonight. May God bless your home. Protect the people you love. Comfort the memories that still ache, and guide you toward the next good thing when it appears in your road.